Greetings and welcome to the Cybersecurity Summit, DC Metro Securing the Hybrid and Remote Workforce panel. I have with me an exciting group of panelists, and I'll first tell you who I am, and then I'll switch to introductions of each of the panelists. I'm Kathleen Moriarty, Chief Technology Officer at Center for Internet Security, a nonprofit who has best practice information available for free download for any organization to use. And with that, I'm going to turn over to our panelists for introductions, beginning with Michael Oldham.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Catherine. I'm Michael Oldham. I'm the founder of PortSys. We're a security company, obviously, and we provide technologies that help organizations migrate from the kind of current architecture that they have to a zero trust architecture, and do it in a way that we find to be pretty easy, and so do our customers.
Great, thank you. So next up, David Anteles.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Anteles. I am the Senior Technical Director at Skybox Security. I've been in the industry roughly about 30 years and have had many different roles. I'm excited to be here with this exciting panel. And, at Skybox, what we do is we are an analytics platform that focuses on a lot of different areas of the environment, including, vulnerability management. So excited to be here. Look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, David. Rob Smith.
Hi, I'm Rob Smith. I'm former lead remote access analyst for Gartner, and today I advise Proofpoint and help them out.
Thank you, Rob. And Chris Davis.
Hi, Chris Davis. I work for Arctic Wolf. I'm one of the senior sales engineers there, covering down on large enterprise. And we're a SOC as a service. We take all the telemetry that you have and bring it together and do vulnerability management, MDR, and security awareness training.
Great, thank you. And Tommy Todd?
Yes, Tommy Todd, Vice President of Security at Code 42. We specialize in helping organizations solve the insider risk challenges. I've been in cyber for well over 25 years at this point, focused on the data privacy, data protection concern, and I'm also responsible for our own internal insider risk management program.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least, Brandon Conley.
Thanks, excited to be here. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of App Omni. Prior to that, ran sales and SE teams at Palo Alto Networks, Citrix, Netscope, and a number of other cybersecurity companies. App Omni is a SaaS security posture management company. So we help our customers identify risk in their major SaaS platforms and remediate them.
Excellent. So I'm excited to be here with this seasoned panelist of experts, and we'll dive right into learning more about securing the hybrid and remote workforce. So with that, the first question, as more employers and employees are choosing to be remote over returning to the office, how can organizations go about quantifying the risk this poses? So let's kick off with Michael.
Thanks very much. So there are a lot of different things when you start thinking about the risk with remote employees. The first thing that most people comes to mind is the end users themselves. Their devices, their credentials, those sorts of things become a real challenge for people. So, you're looking at things like multi-factor authentication, et cetera, to be able to help to improve the security posture there. But it's not just that, because there's a lot more that goes into somebody being remote. When somebody is remote, their context of access is also really important. Are they coming in on a trusted device? Are they coming in from the family's laptop? What are the challenges that you're looking at from a security perspective that you have to manage when you're looking at that from the end user's perspective? But equally, when you start looking at the architecture of the organization is so important. So one of the things that we see all the time is that, we see evidence every day of all the hacks and things that occur that are in the news. And a big part of that is the way people's architectures are. There's still architectures from 30 or 40 years ago where we've got the perimeter defense, but it's all soft and gooey on the inside. Once somebody gets through that perimeter, now they can start to pivot and attack other resources within that. And that's what most of the hackers are trying to do. So you've got to find a way to change that infrastructure, not have it be open once you get on the inside, make changes to that, and do other things when you start looking at technologies, because a lot of organizations have way too many technologies in place for managing access. They have all kinds of ports open to the outside world, which is important if you're trying to get access, but the hackers can see those too. So if the hackers are seeing those ports and throwing attacks at those ports, and they're doing other things like phishing credentials and doing all kinds of other attacks. If you've got the wrong architecture in place, if you have too many ports open to the outside world, these are all things that are going to contribute to a real challenging security environment. And most organizations don't have the resources to try to keep up with all that.
Great, thank you. David, would you like to add to quantifying the risk?
Absolutely, would love to. Michael brings up a lot of great points, in terms of we've extended, the architecture out to the periphery, and that's beyond the traditional beyond the traditional boundaries of networking and security. We've extended VPNs and access to people's homes, and people have been using their devices and then maybe someone else's devices, but now we have to account for, the home architecture, Xboxes, PCs, home devices, and even maybe the neighbor stopped over with his phone, things of that nature, things that we don't typically consider in a traditional business architecture or business deployment of devices, where we typically have our arms wrapped around. And even then, when you're looking at security, you have to look not just at the device itself, but the behavior of the individual running those devices. What are they doing, at home, and are they going to bring that back with them, that type of behavior back to the workplace? It's a difficult conundrum because, we're talking about privacy on the device side, but we're also trying to understand, can we microsegment? Can we isolate devices or applications internally so as to safeguard it from those accesses coming from the outside? So really, it's taking into account all of the various different elements. One, home-based networking that was established by the business, maybe a VPN concentrator, firewall, router, what have you, that was issued by the company. Then the laptops, and then of course you have all of the various different services and resources that we are trying to get in, as Michael calls, the soft GUI center. We allow a lot of these ports to be open, and that is absolutely true. In order to do business, we have to allow things to go out. A lot of the bad guys do come in, they sit there and they do reconnaissance, they grab what they need and they sit on a known port and away they go. So we have to kind of manage that and bridge that, whether it be, again, microsegmentation, throwing some sort of application-based, firewall out there to govern the access, user ID authentication. Who, are we trusting who we are supposedly trusting to come into the network, and do we trust who they say they are? So there's a lot of different facets to it that I think people have to look at now that we've extended it out into the wild, so to speak.
Thank you. Both made some really great points towards zero trust tenants and the importance, and even brought to mind listening. What about mesh networking? And you don't know if your neighbor's mesh is joining yours, unbeknownst to you, right? So these principles really begin to matter more. And Rob, would you like to add to this, please?
Sure. Just to follow on what Michael and David were saying, I think we as IT often don't see the big picture. And what I mean by that is we try to get involved in technology without first figuring out what we want to do. And in order to quantify risk, you actually have to know your use case before anything else. This is by far the most important thing. And so in order to figure out your use case, there's actually 4 simple variables you need to look at. The first and most obvious is who's the user. Now, I compare it to George Orwell's Animal Farm. Some users are more equal than others. What you're going to do for the CEO is very different than what you're going to do for the receptionist. And often in the past with remote access, everybody got treated equally because very few people work remotely. Now, as you see, everybody on this panel is all over the world. I myself am in Europe, even though I'm from the States. And so you've got to know the user and their job function. The second thing you need to know, and following definitely what David and Michael said, is what's the device and who owns it? PC, Mac, iPhone, Android, is it the companies or is it the users? You can't trust a personally owned device. You have to assume it has ransomware or some other form of malware on it versus a corporate device that's locked down, patched, and managed. These are 2 very different things. And then for that matter, iPhones are, statistically much safer than Android, but you can actually take an Android device and lock it down much further than you ever could an iPhone. So once again, the device matters, but more importantly to all that is the data and apps the user needs access to. Very frequently, one of the changes we saw during the pandemic is a total cloud shift. And so if you're just using Office 365, why do you care? You can set all the policies for Office 365 and move on. But if you start and want to do more detailed or perhaps on-prem, then you might still need a legacy VPN. And then last but not least is where in the world is a user located? As I said, I'm in Europe. We're under GDPR. Yet, if you go to the US, California has CCPA, yet you just go east of Nevada and there's no privacy regulations. So it really matters, these four variables: user, device, data, location. And when you figure that out, you can figure out a picture of the user and quantify the risk accordingly.
Great, that makes a lot of sense. And so one of the biggest threats we face is phishing attacks. I'd like to get an idea of what security policies and practices should companies put in place to avoid employees falling victim to a phishing scheme and possibly a ransomware attack. Chris, would you like to kick this one off?
Happy to. So I think the other folks talked about it and touched on it earlier, especially with Rob coming in. So at the end of the day, security experts and the industry as a whole, unfortunately, as it's pivoted and it's grown, it's become more lucrative, we should say. It's actually become an industry unto itself, has kind of taken this stance where it's like, we're the be all and end all, the gatekeepers of everything that needs to happen. Like, you can't do this unless it flows through this. And it's actually wrong. The business still has to grow, as Rob was alluding to. It's still got to go out and make money. And so you've got multiple departments that have to do that. And the security is actually an advisory role, right? You've got to kind of come in, take that advisory role, and you have to let the business do what it needs to do. But it needs to do it in a safe manner. And honestly, you don't always have control over making that as safe as possible. So, pivoting back over to what does that mean for ransomware? You've got to understand how your company conducts business, right? How do they engage? What kind of products do they have? Where are they going? Who's the most engaging outward facing? Is it your C-level? Is it your marketing folks? Is it your recruiter? Are you a small company, big company? All these different things, right? And then you got to go back to data, like what data is important. Is it IP? Is it PII? If so, where is it housed? How easy is it get to? We talked about the GUI insides right there. David alluded to that, right? Or maybe it was Michael. I apologize if I screwed that up, but getting in there and compartmentalizing all this stuff and setting up those controls with restricted access and all the privileged access, who has access to what, all these remote workers. And then you've got to start basic awareness training at a minimum for your employees, right? Push out campaigns, see what those click rates are, and don't punish, encourage, right? If somebody clicks on something, hey, that's great. Now we know what could get to you. Send that to your security team, have them learn from that. It's like, okay, seeing a high click rate on these types of attacks. That alludes back to these campaigns, which we know these particular attackers are using. Let's focus on that and figure out where we can shore those gaps out. And then more importantly, I think you got to plan your response. We were doing CTI frameworks and programs back at Optiv for companies, it was actually surprising how many people don't execute plans on what happens if. So if we get ransomware, we get attacked, we get shut down. Now what? What happens? What's the plan? How do we execute? Nobody does that because it's time consuming, right? It takes resources, it takes time, it takes people off of their jobs, but figure out what that is, walk that backwards, ask that question to how do we get back to 100%? And I think you'll start to see where the gaps are. And from there, you can begin to fill them with technology, better policies, better controls, things of that nature. Kaspersky released an interesting study on the ransomware groups recently, like what the most top 6 successful ransomware groups executed for 2021. And they were literally, it's basically being vulnerable to certain exploits, right? With external services and RDP. And that's how they would go out, scan, figure it out, and then get in. And then more importantly, the key thing was in addition to that, to getting in, they did not omit a very technical and very forceful phishing campaign against employees to still gain access. So things to chew on.
Great, thank you. Those are some really good points to think ahead to being prepared. And Rob, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, sure. What I would say about it, quite frankly, is that I don't care who you are. I don't care how much experience you have. At some point, you're going to click on the dumb link. Fact. No amount of training is going to solve this. I can tell you, more than one analyst who I know has clicked on either an intentional or unintentional phishing email. And so security awareness training is mega important. Don't ever diminish the importance of it. But, and here's the big but, you need to have tools in place to stop this. You need to have traffic routed over a SASE, for example, or just a software web gateway SWG. On-device content filtering, a lot of the EPP, the antivirus platforms come with on-device content filtering. And so the tools and having them hidden behind the scenes and configured will go a very long way in helping. Because quite frankly, when a 30-year veteran analyst clicks on the link that literally says, click here for a free cookie, and he clicked on the link, and then it's a phishing trap that says there's no such thing as a free cookie. And that's actually a true story. You know, there's no way to stop it all.
Yeah, you raised some really good points there, Rob. One of the things that CIS put out as guidance towards people is thinking about whether or not you're having an emotional response. If you're having an emotional response, and the 4 Fs, you can go look those up, to any one of the 4 Fs, that you should really pause and think about whether or not you should respond. And attackers could be highly targeting you as well. And so it could be just extremely well crafted. So pausing is important. David, would you like to chime in?
Find my mute button. Yes, absolutely. Chris and Rob made important points, and I'd like to highlight, something Chris said, is that, we in security, or the security industry as a whole, I think we've overstepped our bounds in terms of making it very like sorcery or magic, that security is this thing that should be guarded by a select few. And that kind of has added this sense of mysticism, or taken the responsibility out of the hands of those that are actually using the technology. And a lot of companies that I do business with oftentimes run into this issue where they're like, we have these programs in place, but it's not working. Why are they still doing these things? And in part, I think a lot of the adoption around phishing campaigns, or anti-phishing campaigns, I should say, is due in part because they often get penalized. And, Chris made that point, is you have to incentivize somebody in order to go into good behavior. It's more of that positive affirmation or positive reinforcement that is going to get better results than taking somebody to task because they clicked on a link. If you make it easy for an individual to, one, understand what they're looking at, two, being able to report it easily without having to go through a bunch of red tape, and maybe reward them with some concrete, rewards, you will have a little bit better, better outcomes. But again, the user population needs to bear some skin in the game, but also it's incumbent upon us in the security field to make it much more tenable for them to be more reactive and more proactive in what they're looking at when they get a link.
Great points. And Michael?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think, to Chris and Rob's point, IT used to be the department of no. Security was the department of no. That was the power word, is just, no, you can't have that access. But today, business is much more important. The focus of the business, what you're doing for the organization, is much more important. And so we have to be able to enable. If your IT security is limiting your business capabilities, that's not going to fly in the future. It's just, it's already here. You have to be able to be an enabler for the organization. And that's one of the reasons why you have to change the architecture and the way things have been done for so long, is that if you don't, you're going to be behind the 8 ball, you can be dragging behind, and this is going to be a boat anchor that's going to continue to drag on the organization itself. And we have to do more to make it easier for the users. We absolutely have to educate the users, make sure that they understand, but the technology has to make the end users' lives easier, not harder. If we can't do that, then end users are very, very creative at finding ways around security and finding the vulnerable spots and creating things, the shadow IT and all kinds of other things, if they're given the rope to be able to go and do that, if they're facing resistance in everything they do. So we really have to focus on those things.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And that really lends well towards what we're seeing in terms of the direction for industry, right? Moving towards zero trust and shifting left. So having the products take care of more to take those responsibilities off the user. And for us, CIS managing state, local, tribal, and territorial organizations with very few resources, that push is so important, right? And for every other under-resourced organization, which includes large ones too. So with that, I'm going to jump to the next question, and that was a great discussion. So let's talk about insider threat. Most insider threat attacks are actually non-malicious. How can employees effectively educate their employees on good cyber hygiene to minimize the risk of non-malicious employees who may be vulnerable to cyber attacks? And this is, of course, in that gap before we really get to zero trust and this ideal shift left picture. So Tommy, would you like to kick this off?
Yeah, this is actually a question that's very dear to my heart because it's one of the challenges that I'm faced with on a daily basis. Most of the activity that we typically see in an organization is non-malicious. When you think about it, we're all humans. We make mistakes. We have errors in judgment. We're exposed to new tool sets every day without proper education, and we make mistakes, and it's just the nature of the beast. That being said, there's a secondary challenge that we're faced with, and that is the way we've approached education up until now. Generally speaking, education was reserved for maybe once or twice a year. It's an all-day event. You go through this reminder of what our privacy policies are, what the security is asking for, what your commitments training. And the reality is that those are too far and few between. Those types of events, people just go through the motions, right? They're so routine. There's not really much new in the way of content, and you end up in this situation where it's just a drone. So none of it really resonates with an employee. So where the gap is being filled today, and one of the things that we've been able to take advantage of just to help with our own program, is the ability to invoke micro training moments based on incidents. So when we typically see somebody put our data at risk, we'll educate them in the moment, and it's automated. So it's literally a micro training session, a couple of minutes of a video that basically it's contextual. So it'll say, hey, we noticed that you did something, it goes against our policy. As a reminder, here's what our policy looks like. When did you mean to do this? And if you did, we log all this. Anyway, the point being is that it allows our analysts to free up about 85% of their day to focus on the things that really matter in an organization. And as a result, the downstream effect is you get a couple of things. You get behavior changes because now people have been educated in the moment. It's relevant, it's contextual. So they can't hide behind the I didn't know excuse, which we hear a lot, right? Oh, I didn't know better. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Well, now you've been educated, right? And when we see the repeat offender rate go down dramatically, literally from 500 events a week down to 2, almost overnight, we're getting rid of the repeat offenders. But on the downstream effect of that from a practitioner point of view is that as you invoke these micro training sessions, you integrate it with attestations. So you get acknowledgement from the employees that, yes, I've been trained. Yes, I understand the policy. It's kind of one of those empathetic ways to respond to an employee's activities, right? And you're hoping to change behaviors, with the goal being that as you have an employee that has been educated and they continue to either make these mistakes or become intentional with their data exfiltration, now you can ratchet up how you respond, right? So think of it like a 3-strike process, right? Strike 1, you get educated. Strike 2, maybe you've got an investigator that's talking to you. Strike 3, we're talking to your manager. So we can start to ratchet up that punitive response, but we don't start with a punitive response. We start empathetically. So I think this is the gap that needs to be filled with education, and it needs to be an automated, integrated way so that you can take the burden away from your security practitioners, right? They can focus on other tasks while this education model is being enforced.
Great, thank you. And David, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Tommy brings up a lot of great points, and in particular, kind of piggybacks off what we were talking about a little bit earlier, is that with education, you can't club them over the head. You can't come at them hot. We have to be empathetic, as Tommy mentioned. There has to be dealt with a level of empathy, but on top of that, we also have to hit them in the moment. Just like you would do, when you're training an athlete or you're training, even chastising your child. You don't wait until next week, or 2 months down the road to tell them about, hey, do you remember what you did last week? Chances are they're not, but you hit it up so that it's relevant. You capture that information, and then we assess on how to best approach. How do we address the problem that occurred? Did you click on this link? Do you understand what you're looking at? Do you understand what the ramifications are for this? Because a lot of times they don't understand the underpinnings of what possibly could happen to the organization as a whole. Do you know that if you clicked on this link and we were going to get compromised, you may be out of a job because there's no business. We've lost all confidentiality, all integrity, and all availability of our organization. So being able to make it relevant to the business, why it matters or why it should matter, is really important. And on top of that, again, I like to say, just like Tommy mentioned, 3 strikes. Let's get it to the point where you've been informed, you've been educated, Here's the reasons, the who, the what, the where's, and the whys. Now, the next time it happens, it's going to be more than a wrist slap. And then the third time, we're going to have to be a little bit more punitive in terms of talking to your management or writing you up or putting you on a plan or something, because we are creatures of habit, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer for us to move the change, so to speak. So yeah, I would offer just be open to having open conversations and more frequent trainings, and keeping it relevant and fresh with what's actually happening in the marketplace today.
Great. And you've teed up the next question quite well. So most organizations realize they have insider risk, but few have programs that are mature or even dedicated resources. What advice would you give to an organization that's just getting started with insider risk and threat management? Brandon, could you please kick this one off for us?
So everything we do here at App Omni is focused on SaaS, and we see everything through that lens. When it comes to insider risk and SaaS, like most other environments, the first thing you need is visibility. And most security teams today have little or no visibility into how their SaaS applications are configured from a security perspective, who has access to what data, which varies from app to app. So I think a really good first step, like almost anything else, is to gain that visibility, have a view into the current running state of your environment, and whether that conforms to your desired state. That would be my first step.
Great, thank you. Chris?
Sure. So, I mean, there's let the other folks talk to the tech side of the house, but you've got like CISA, NIST 800-53, minor attack. There's plenty of free resources, YouTube, blogs. Like, go out there and figure out what information is out there on that insider risk, and recognize that there's a transition from insider risk to insider threat, right? One's a threat, one's a risk. And then you got to figure out your risk appetite. Going back to the first thing, how does a business operate? Who's got the most amount of access? And then all of that, what information is most critical to the company? And I'm going to actually step outside the box a little bit on this one. You need to have a talk with your HR and with your management and everything else, because the only way that somebody becomes a disgruntled employee is if they're not being treated. And those are the greatest amount of folks that flip over from risk to threat, right? So how's everybody feeling? Are the programs incentivized? Is there proactive career track going on? Has HR noticed any kind of habits or behavior from employees outside of what they were talking? Brandon was talking about with the user behavioral analysis for what your apps are doing. That's all perfect, and that all needs to be done. But get to know your stakeholders. What's going on inside of your company? What policies are in place, and then hopefully you can get ahead of it right before it becomes something that you need to address. Unfortunately, in a reactive mode.
Great, thank you. And Tommy?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always like to remind people, when it comes to insider risk management, is that it is a program. It's not necessarily a product, right? You can't just throw technology at the problem and expect that to be the end all be all. So when we talk about IRM as a program, we got to think of it in terms of the people, process, technology approach. Right. And I also like to throw in culture, right? Culture has a lot to do with how you manage your insider risk program. A lot of times we think in terms of disruptiveness. Well, I see a lot of organizations moving away from that. They don't want to be disruptive in their approach. They want to be empathetic. They want to create a culture of collaboration rather than disrupting that model. So, to accent some things that Chris mentioned, stakeholders, making sure you understand all the different business partners that are involved in a program, because it affects everyone in an organization. When we talk about insider risk in relation to data exfiltration and the data protection concern, it applies to everyone, and it should apply to all data. So the scope of the problem can get a little bit challenging, a little bit daunting at times. I've seen organizations try to boil the ocean and do everything all at once. And the reality is there's a maturity curve to it, right? Just acknowledging you need an IRM program in the first place, and then working backwards from that. We already mentioned standards, looking at NIST, looking at ISO, looking at different frameworks to understand what are the technical controls associated with things like insider risk. Is important, right? But also, again, taking stake of what your company's all about. Could it absorb an IRM program at this stage, right? Is it mature enough in its own security stack to be able to support an effort like that? And if you have all the right tools in place, then you're already well ahead, right? A lot of people already have a lot of the technology that they need to support IRM. So it's just a matter of working backwards and looking at the people and the process components of it.
Great, thank you. The use of frameworks and controls are really important to make sure your approach is holistic. So I'm glad to hear a few of you raise that. And Rob, do you have something to add on this one?
I do. So to follow up on what Tommy and Chris said, to quote Douglas Adams, don't panic. If you're a new organization, quite simply put, you're going to be lost, completely lost in the dark. There's so much resource data out there from a policy and procedure standpoint. And so make sure you are covering, yourself legally with HR and legal, and know all the implications state to state and country to country, because this is really a case where location matters most. And then on the technology side, overwhelmingly, what I would tell you is people don't know how to manage this stuff. It becomes a negative resource. You end up chasing your tail, and you start looking for threats that aren't threats, false positives. You run around in circles. And this is why, especially if you're a new organization and you don't have a SOC and you only have a couple of security people on staff, your best choice is to go for an MDR, a managed detection and response. Somebody who will outsource the monitoring and threat monitoring and detection for you, so that they're experts looking at what's going on. And if you look at most of the EPP vendors, they offer MDR as an add-on now. And so really twofold. First, don't reinvent the wheel. Go look at all the resources that are out there. And second, don't try to manage this yourself from a technology standpoint, because you'll just kill yourself.
Okay, great points. And we're going to dive into a technology specific question. So not exactly the best lead-in, but this is a really important technology, multi-factor authentication. Does it eliminate the risk posed by employees using personal devices for work? Right. Yes, everybody's shaking their head no, and I'm right there with you. If MFA is set up, is privileged access management still necessary? So I'm sure we're going to get some heated responses for this question worded to draw out response. So Michael, would you like to kick off?
Sure. The answer is, excuse me, just because you have multi-factor authentication in place, it doesn't mean that you're secure. It doesn't mean that you don't need some kind of access management, whether it's privileged access management or even regular access management to the resources that you're trying to get access to. Multi-factor authentication is a really good step because it takes your existing set of credentials and strengthens that quite a bit, but it's not infallible. So you really need to look at a lot of other factors of authentication, not just multi-factor, but multiple factors of authentication. Other things that go into a connection, because that also matters. So somebody who is sitting on their corporate managed laptop in the organization in the organization's network is very different from somebody at home on their home PC. But even if you take that person who's in the, with multi-factor and everything with the hardcore managed laptop, and you take that person and move them to a different location, their context has changed. Should they still get access to that privileged information? That's an organizational decision as to who gets access to what and under what circumstances. And that's one of the things that's really been missing for a while is the context of access. And we really have to pay attention to what the context is as well. The same thing goes for privileged access management. You're looking at administrators or other people. You've really got to look at the context of how you're going to allow those people to get access, right? Under what circumstances? The person who's an administrator, if they're sitting at the office when problems tend not to happen, it's usually in the middle of the night. It's a very different circumstance to that person who's at home on their own PC because they forgot to bring home their other one, but the network is down and they have to figure out something right away. So how do you allow that or not allow that within the organization? There's a lot more that goes into it with context and many other things that you have to take into account.
All right, great points. And Rob?
Sure. One of my favorite lines is identity matters most. You can build the best security in the world, but if your identity fails, you now have my access. You can come in and pretend to be me. And so this is why just using MFA isn't enough. And to really follow up on Michael, it needs to be continuous. You need to be looking at other variables. And there's a lot of biometric stuff out there to look at persona data, how you type. There's tools out there that will even use the webcam to see if it's really you in front of it. Now, a lot of organizations view that as intrusive and spying. So it ultimately comes back to what I keep saying is knowing the use case. And if I'm accessing something very sensitive like R&D information that's going to affect the stock price and you really need to have super strong authentication that's continuous in place. Versus if I'm just a salesperson accessing marketing data sheets, MFA is going to be good enough. And so it's understanding that balance between knowing who the user is and what you actually want to accomplish. But in a nutshell, identity matters most.
All right, great. Thank you. And let's see, we'll move on to the next question. How do you determine which company data and infrastructure is most important to protect? And who should have access to these sensitive items? Chris, could you please kick this one off?
Sure. So I think we've all seen a recurring theme here throughout this thing, which is just access, know your company, know who needs to get an access to the information, know what's important, right? And I think that's just as applicable here, right? You've got to sit down, you've got to have the hard conversations. You know, what are we doing? Who needs access to it? How important are they? How do they engage? Figure out where all of their, you know, their gaps are, right? Their attack vectors, and kind of shore those up accordingly. Escalated privileges, all of that. And in the end, what you also have to remember, talk about shadow IT, so that goes back to culture, multiple facets, but you've also got to look at the legacy systems too, right? Like, how is all of that being stored? Is it encrypted? What got moved over? Who has access to it? Because you'll have employees that have been there for long periods of time that just, as the company's grown, they've just shifted over to the new stuff, but they still have access to old things. You know, what policies do you have in place to make sure that those employees no longer have access to that data, or it's moved? All of these things come into play. So, you know, I wish there was an easy answer. People are always looking for the, you know, as Tommy alluded to earlier, the technology easy button. There isn't one. You've got to sit down. You've got to have those hard conversations. You've got to figure out who, you know, the importance are, C-level, look at where the biggest attack vectors are, and then go from there and build your program accordingly, and then implement as such.
Great, thank you. And Brandon.
Now, this is a fun one for me. I remember 20 years ago, large enterprise customers that I was working with thought that at some point in the future, they would have access control level attributes for every user in their LDAP profile or AD profile. And they'd somehow be able to manage that, you know, centrally at a higher level of abstraction. But then and now, I think the truth remains that only the application owners know who should have access to what in their applications. And there's really no way that security by itself as a separate entity can make those decisions, right? So I think it's very important for organizations to deploy tools that, once again, give them visibility, can calculate exactly who has access to what and why in these applications, and then act as a bridge to the IT teams that are managing those apps on a day-to-day basis to sit down and say, this is what the access is. Does this look right to you? Right. And as the prior guest said, have a conversation about whether the access that's set up is appropriate or not, and if changes need to be made.
Okay, I think the two of you just rounded out the conversation really nicely, bringing us back to the importance of control frameworks, looking at the problem holistically, prioritizing what you go after. I'll put a plug in for the free CIS controls there, because they actually prioritize what you should go after based on the current set of threats. And they work either standalone or with a control framework. So if you don't know what to go after, take a look at that to see, do you have some low-hanging fruit that really should be gone by addressing those biggest, the ones that give you the biggest bang for your buck. And so with that, I'd like to give everybody a moment for closing thoughts. And so we'll start with Michael.
I think there's been a great conversation, lots of great points. I think one of the things that you have to think about when you're looking at this is a way to simplify your organization's IT infrastructure. You know, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, is we have so many products from different vendors controlling access for different aspects, whether it's, you know, VPNs or RDP or cloud applications or MDM, all these different technologies that somebody has to go in and manage, maintain, have to be expert in, they have to keep them up to date. Organizations are really challenged to even keep up with patches. You know, you've got organizations out there that haven't patched things that have been outside vulnerabilities for more than a year that people know about, and they still haven't gotten around to being able to patch because they don't have enough resource and staff to be able to make that happen, or expertise. So we've got to simplify that infrastructure overall. We've got to come up with ways that makes it easier for the end users to be able to participate. Whether, you know, you're doing some through education, but you're also trying to simplify the process. so that they don't have to go to 15 different places to sign into these different applications with these sets of credentials. And, you know, if the moon is blue and you're standing on your left foot, you type this password instead. You know, we've made it so difficult for the end users. We've got to find ways to simplify this and bring all of this back together so that we can start to get control over our environments. And this extends to local and cloud. All of those have to be able to be brought together into a single unified framework that you can manage in an effective way.
Thank you. I think we're going to see a lot of progress toward those points in the next few years, just with how industry is moving and you know, how each of you are presenting your points today as well. So with that, Tommy, would you like to?
Yeah. So, you know, just as a reminder, you know, as we all know, insider risk is on the rise, right? It's been on the rise for the last couple of years. It's only gotten worse with the pandemic. You know, we continue in this hybrid workforce environment where your data sprawl is going to get worse and worse. So, you know, insider risk is a relatively new thing for security teams trying to tackle it because of all the other challenges that they have with ransomware and, you know, phishing and things of that nature. And so it oftentimes gets deprioritized. And the reality is it shouldn't. It should be actually at the first and foremost because your data is the most valuable thing in your organization. But it also doesn't have to be complex. So I like the fact that Michael pointed out that we need simplification, right? We need to look at solutions and programs in a more simple lens, right? We don't have the resources or the budget or the time to build this big monstrosity of a program just to try to get a handle on our data protection strategy. So it doesn't have to be, right? And so insider risk management in and of itself is not designed to be complex. It's designed to be, as you know, provide you the deepest visibility. It's designed to get you ahead of your insider risk concerns. And it's something that I enjoy talking about. I'm very passionate about this topic because, again, I manage it, so I understand. So if you're on the prowl for something like that, you know, I highly encourage you guys, you know, again, as we mentioned, frameworks, take a look at what the technical controls are out there, what kind of solutions are available to you. Think about it in terms of people, process, and technology. And there's no time like the present to get started if you haven't already.
Great, thank you. Transforming security is so important right now as we move forward. And with that, Brandon.
Well, I want to thank everybody else who was on the panel. I enjoyed hearing everybody's perspectives. You know, from my perspective, being much more deep in the weeds on the technical side of a specific problem set, one thing I'd like to remind the audience is that 90% of breaches in cloud come from misconfigurations, right? And finding those and fixing them is, you know, is as simple as gaining visibility into your configs. And, you know, that should be the first step, I think, for anybody looking to mitigate risk, particularly in SaaS, but it applies to everything.
Great, thank you. And Rob.
Sure. So the pandemic changed how we work. It used to be remote users, you have one policy for everybody. Now, if you have one policy for everybody, you'll fail. You really, truly have to figure out what you want to do and then build the technology around it. And so to assess the risk, you can't do it without knowing the use cases and defining the use case and what you want to do and how you want to do it. And am I on the moon or am I in Gibraltar or am I in Philly? Really is a big difference. And so because of this, to bring it full circle, figure out what the heck you want to do before ever looking at policies and technology. And then, and only then, start expanding out and say, how can we simplify this? Because as has been said several times, we are not the department of no anymore. You're the department of yes, figure it out while mitigating the risk as much as humanly possible.
Great, thank you, Rob. Chris.
I think everybody's already said it. But at the end of the day, just encourage the audience, you know, whatever you're facing, go out, crowdsource it. You have friends, you have mentors, you have colleagues. See what's been done, know your company, know what you're doing, know what your tech stack is. And I would say ask hard questions of vendors, to what Rob was talking about. You know, make sure that what they can do not only solves the problem that you have, and hopefully multiple problems, not just one. We've all walked on the floor, black hat and RSA. It's mind boggling how many vendors are out there now, but make sure that they can also work with the ecosystem that you have, the tech stack that you have in place, your vendors, all of that. That's important. And get that advice from your colleagues who've been through it, done it 100 times before, so you don't end up, you know, making the same mistakes they did.
Great. And David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us. Definitely, educate your people. That's part one. We got to take a step towards educating our user base, but also educating why they need to be concerned about things. But on top of that, when we take our security approaches, let's not mystify it. Let's not overcomplicate it. We do have to simplify it. I've heard it a couple of times. Simplification is a process by which we are going to make things a little bit better. But how do we do that? We need to automate some of this. We can't do it manually. We can't continuously do it alone. As Rob mentioned, you have to have an advocate. You have to be working with somebody who can help you look at things holistically and not just at one area, specific area, and understand your use cases. He brings a really strong point: is understand those use cases. Why are we doing this? What is this going to solve, and how is this going to end up empowering our business to continue to go on without having to worry whether or not we just cracked open Pandora's box. So at the end of the day, let's look at and understand the context of our environments, our networks, our security frameworks. ZTNA, it's here. We need to adopt that, and we need to take a good look at how does that apply? How do all these different facets apply to that framework? And go from there.
Wonderful. A big thank you to each of our expert panelists. The themes brought forward today and the emphasis on key points that I like to phrase a little differently as built-in security at scale. So that simplification really is a shift left so that the vendor is taking on more of the responsibility to do the ongoing management of security over time. And that will ease the burden on the end user and organizations. So that's something I look forward to in the next few years. And many of you brought those points out really nicely today. And so with that, our time is up for this panel. But if you have more questions and would like to engage with our experts and their organizations, please visit the booths following the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.